The year was 1692, and the wind that prowled the Massachusetts coast had teeth. It scraped across the frozen marshes, rattled through the pine boards of the meeting house, and whispered around the corners of every shuttered home in Salem village. Inside those homes, candles wavered, shadows danced, and the faithful told themselves that the sound outside was only the wind. Yet even as they prayed, the chill that slid beneath their doors felt older and less natural than any winter. A door creaked. A prayer was whispered. A voice answered that prayer in silence. They said it began with the children, but the children were only echoes. The true beginning lay somewhere deeper, in the roots of belief where fear feeds on devotion. For years, the settlers had watched the forest line and imagined what it hid. Wolves, demons, the restless souls of those who had died without baptism. In every dark shape, they saw the outline of punishment waiting. They had crossed an ocean to build a pure city, yet purity, once declared, must constantly be defended. They were tired of defending. By the first hard frost, the fields had surrendered their color. The earth itself seemed to draw a breath and hold it. In that stillness, rumor found its voice. One neighbor spoke of a dream of fire curling from her chimney when the hearth was cold. Another swore that a woman's shadow had passed his window, though no footstep marked the snow. A third had seen a circle drawn in the dust of the mill floor and could not say who made it. The circle, the dream, the shadow. Small things, harmless alone. Together, they became evidence. Every settlement builds a story to explain its fear. Salem's story began with light. Fire had always been a companion to the people here. It warmed their hands, cooked their bread, forged their tools. But in sermons and in scripture, fire meant more. It was God's instrument, a purifier, a test, a mirror in which sin might see its own reflection. So when fear came to Salem, it wore the face of purification. They believed that through trial, the soul could be cleansed, that through suffering, it might be refined, that only in the furnace of tribulation could the dross of corruption be burned away to reveal the gold of grace. An idea older than any sermon had taken root among them, the notion that fire could change more than wood and metal, that it could change the human heart itself. To the philosophers of Europe, that idea had another name. They called it alchemy. To the ministers of Salem, that word sounded like blasphemy. To the villagers, it sounded like witchcraft. The difference was small, but small differences ignite great fires. As the nights grew longer, so did the prayers. Mothers whispered verses over sleeping children. Fathers kept watch at the windows. Somewhere in the distance, the wolves howled, and each cry was folded neatly into the fabric of superstition. A traveler passing through might have seen only stillness, a settlement of neat houses, snow-covered fields, a meeting-house steeple rising cleanly against the grey sky. He would not have heard the pulse beneath it, the murmured confessions, the half-spoken doubts, the creak of timber that made a man wonder if something unseen had leaned its weight against his door. Within the tavern the talk was cautious. Too loud, and one might be accused of mockery. Too soft, and one might be accused of hiding something. The safest voice in Salem was the one that repeated whatever the minister had said that morning. Fear is clever. It teaches silence first, then speech, the kind that serves its purpose. The snow kept falling. Each dawn found new tracks leading from one house to another, simple paths worn by ordinary errands, but soon even footprints began to look suspicious. Who visited whom? Who lingered too long? Who closed the door quickly when a neighbor approached? These were questions with answers, and answers with consequences. A mother mixed herbs in a small bowl, crushing them with the back of a spoon. The scent rose warm and sharp, a promise of healing. But when her neighbor caught the smell through the open window, the promise became accusation. "Strange spices," she said. "Foreign." The word foreign meant dangerous. It meant different. It meant not ours. By morning, the story had changed hands 3 times. By evening, the herbs had become powders, the powders charms, the charms an oath sworn to darkness. And so it went, from mouth to mouth, each telling adding a grain of salt to the wound. At first, no one wanted to believe. Then, everyone did. It is the oldest alchemy in the world. Rumor into truth, truth into fear, fear into fire. By midwinter, the sky itself seemed weary. Ash fell from the chimneys like grey snow. Somewhere, a child coughed in her sleep, and her mother crossed herself, though crossing was not a Puritan's way. Outside, a figure moved through the drifts, a lantern swinging at his side. He was only a messenger, but to the woman watching through the slats of her shutter, he was something else, the first sign that judgment had begun to walk. She whispered a prayer for her soul, though she could not name her sin. The wind answered, and the fire, patient until then, breathed in the silence. Morning came late that winter. The sun rose like a weak promise, lighting a world that no longer trusted its own reflection. People moved through their chores as if every motion might betray them. Eyes lingered, tongues measured their own words before releasing them. It began with a sickness no physician could name. The afflicted cried out in the night, claimed unseen hands pinched and clawed at their flesh. Ministers prayed over them, and when the fits only grew worse, the cause was decided before the cure was found. Evil had entered the town. Evil needs no proof, only witnesses. The first girl pointed her finger and spoke a name. The crowd gasped, half in horror, half in relief, because at last the darkness had a shape, and it was not their own. Another child followed, and another. The names came faster than the snow could fall. Once spoken, a name does not melt. By dusk, men carried torches through the lanes. The meeting house filled with whispers that moved like wind through dry grass. Some came to watch, some came to be seen watching. All came to be certain that their own faces did not resemble the guilty. Fear is a craftsman. It shapes the world to fit its tools. It turns neighbor into jury, friend into witness, silence into confession. At the edge of town, the Reverend spoke of purification. He said the community had been chosen to reveal the corruption of the age. He said they must separate the pure from the impure, as gold is separated from dross. The blacksmith nodded. He knew the sound of metal screaming in fire. The farmers nodded. They knew the smell of chaff burning from wheat. Everyone understood the metaphor, and that was enough to make it real. Rumor spread faster than the frost. It crossed fences and doorsteps, wrapped itself around the bell ropes of the meeting house, slipped into prayer. Before long, even the prayers had changed. They no longer begged for mercy, they asked for proof. A woman who had once healed a neighbor's child now found her name carved into the bark of an elm behind the tavern. Someone had drawn a small triangle beneath it. A sign, they said, a mark of the devil. She tried to wash it away with snow, but the grooves remained. Children mimicked what they saw. They played at trials in the snowdrifts, accusing each other in laughter that was almost tears. The laughter carried across the frozen river, where it mixed with the creak of the ice and became something else, something that made grown men quicken their step. Every settlement has a threshold it does not see until it has crossed it. Salem crossed its own the night a deputy opened a woman's cupboard and found jars labelled in Latin. Simple remedies: wormwood, valerian, comfrey. Yet the labels spoke in a tongue the town had already condemned. Knowledge had changed languages. What once meant healing now meant heresy. They took the jars into the square. They smashed them on the stones. The smell rose sweet and bitter, like medicine turning to smoke. Someone shouted scripture. Someone else shouted her name. And then there was no need for anyone to shout at all. The crowd had found its rhythm, and rhythm is stronger than reason. Fear had become ceremony. From that night on, every act of daily life carried a question. Who is watching? Who will speak my name next? The baker crossed himself before lighting the oven. The midwife refused to mix herbs unless the minister stood by. Men who once debated the weight of crops now debated the weight of souls. The trials had not yet begun, but the verdict was already written in every cautious glance. In the minister's journal that month, one line appears without explanation. The people are transmuted. He borrowed the word from the philosophers, perhaps without knowing its full meaning, but the word fits. Salem was changing substance. The solid bonds of trust were turning brittle. The air itself seemed charged with invisible particles. Fear made visible, shimmering like heat above the snow. And beneath it all, something older stirred, pleased to see its image reborn. If the devil required followers, he could rest easy here. Fear would serve him well enough. If God required faith, he had it, burning too hot to be questioned. Between those fires, the people stood and called the heat righteousness. A traveler arriving in Salem that week might have believed he had come upon a town preparing for some great festival. Torches, voices, the smell of smoke. Only when he drew closer would he see the faces, pale in the firelight, and realize that the celebration was for their own undoing. The shape of fear is simple. It looks like certainty. The fire that warmed Salem's hearths also warmed its imagination. It had become the single element everyone understood. It destroyed. It revealed. It purified. When they looked into the coals, they saw not only light, but judgment. Across the sea, philosophers wrote of another fire, one hidden inside all matter. They called it the secret sun, the lamp of the world. Its light, they said, burned in every heart that sought truth. The study of that inner flame was alchemy. Its goal was not gold, but illumination. None in Salem would have dared speak that word aloud, yet the idea drifted here all the same. A sailor carried a battered manuscript. A minister's son copied a curious symbol into the margin of a sermon. A merchant kept a vial of mercury among his curios. Each fragment meant little alone, but together they whispered of transformation, that everything base could become pure, that suffering itself might refine the soul. When fear found these fragments, it mistook them for poison. The afflicted girls spoke again, naming the learned, the midwives, the ones who read too much or knew the ways of plants. Those who searched for divine order were accused of bending it. Each accusation fed the next, until reason became the very thing condemned. The court convened. Men in black coats listened as the young cried out and collapsed, as neighbors told stories polished smooth by repetition. Behind their solemn faces, some heard echoes of another chamber, the alchemist's furnace, where metal screams before it changes shape. They did not speak that thought, but it lived inside the rhythm of the trials. Confession, repentance, transformation. Base into noble, sinner into saint, life into death. One observer wrote that the town was tested in God's crucible. He meant it as praise, yet if he had looked closely at the faces in the crowd, he might have seen the same hunger that drove the old philosophers, the hunger to witness change, to watch something impure made bright by flame. But this was a crude experiment. Its reagents were people. Its smoke was prayer. By midsummer, the word alchemy had vanished from speech, but its shadow remained. In the meeting house, they spoke of the refining fire. In the tavern, they whispered of the turning. Each sermon fed the same paradox. To save the soul, destroy the body. To protect the town, consume it. One night, a minister opened his Bible and found, tucked between its pages, a slip of parchment drawn with interlocking circles. He stared at it until the candle guttered. The next morning, he preached on the dangers of curiosity. No one ever saw the parchment again. Another night, a woman dreamed of gold light pouring through the meeting house windows. In her dream, the townsfolk reached toward it, their faces calm, their hands unburned. When she told the dream, they called it a vision from the devil. The dreamer stopped speaking. The light went out. Weeks later, after the first execution, smoke drifted across the fields. The people watched it rise and said the town had been cleansed. Yet, even as they said it, they felt a strange hollowness, like the stillness after metal cools, when it is no longer molten, but not yet shaped. In that silence, some began to ask, what if purification was never meant to be forced? What if the fire was only a mirror, showing what already burned within? The question did not last. Questions rarely do when certainty is easier. But it lingered long enough to leave a mark, an invisible sigil traced on the conscience of the town. Years would pass before anyone named it. Centuries before anyone recognized it as alchemy's ghost. The belief that transformation, once started, cannot be undone. The snow returned early that year. The wind prowled again around the shutters. Inside, families sat by the fire, watching the flames bend and whisper. They told their children stories about the devil in the woods and about the women who had walked too close to his shadow. The children listened, wide-eyed, and in their minds, the shapes of fear began again to take form. And somewhere, beyond the edge of the light, the old idea waited, patient as ever, for the moment when curiosity would once more outrun caution. By the winter's third month, the sickness had taken hold, not of the body, but of the mind. The afflicted cried out in the night and grasped at empty air. They fell stiff as wood, then softened into trembling fits, their words thick with visions. Physicians examined pulse and tongue and found nothing to diagnose. Ministers examined souls and found everything to condemn. Neighborhoods learned new definitions for the ordinary. A candle gutter was a message. A draft became a hand. Silence meant conspiracy. Tears proved guilt. Rumor needed only a single room to begin. It needed the entire town to mature. At the meeting house, a hush lay like frost on the benches. The minister prayed a long prayer, his voice steady, and when he reached the word temptation, the afflicted moaned as if the word itself had teeth. The moan was noted. Everything was noted now. The tilt of a head, the twitch of a hand, the unguarded breath that ran too fast or too slow when a name was spoken. Names. The town had learned that fear becomes manageable when it can be pointed and pointed again. A girl lifted her arm and spoke the first. Relief passed through the congregation. Relief is crueler than accusation because it confirms the accuser's safety. What was once private grief became public evidence. A stillborn lamb, a spoiled jar of butter, the sudden shattering of a pitcher. All were gathered like dry sticks for the town's new fire. They would be burned later, in order, each feeding the flames with the sweet smell of certainty. Outside, the cold sharpened everything. Edges of fences, the corners of door frames, the joints of men's fingers, all seemed to cut the air. Even breath became visible, a small cloud of proof that one lived and therefore could be judged. The afflicted were asked to recall their torments. They recalled them with variations, as suffering often does. They spoke of spectral hands, of creatures small and quick, of a voice beneath the world's voice that promised comfort if they would only name what hurt them. Naming felt like a cure. Naming felt like warmth. The first accused protested calmly, then desperately, then with the weary stillness of someone who knows the trial has no end but one. Her hands were rough from work in winter. Her eyes held the stubborn dignity of a person who has buried more than one season's worth of dead. She did not speak Latin. She did not keep jars of bright powders. She kept, as many did, a few dried leaves for fever, a thread and charm against grief. Such threads break quickly when stretched upon a rack of meaning. She was taken from her home. The neighbours watched and did not meet each other's eyes. Fear improves with practice. The town became efficient, a system of questions, a rhythm of prayer, a pattern of glances that told each person when to speak and when to hold the thread of their own name tight behind their teeth. The river thawed. Ice broke and carried small islands of white downstream. Men watched from the bank and felt a faint relief. The world, at least, had not forgotten how to move. But the thaw did not loosen the mind's grip. It tightened it. At the blacksmith's, men spoke over the hiss of quenching iron about what they had seen. One said a cow's milk curdled as soon as a certain woman passed the gate. Another said his child recovered when a different woman prayed at his bedside. Whose prayer was approved? Whose touch burned the soul? Approval, like fire, spread where the wind took it. If the wind favoured your roof, you were warm. If it did not, you learned to sleep cold. Somewhere in town, a man knelt in his pantry and unfolded a small scrap of paper. On it were 3 interlocking circles drawn in a shaky hand. He had copied them years before from a book he did not own. He had liked the way the circles held each other, as if meaning could be made by patience alone. He placed the paper back beneath the flour bin. He told himself he would burn it tomorrow. He did not. What we intend to burn, we keep, because we believe there will be time to burn it later. Time was running ahead of them now. That week, the afflicted began to name more freely. They found, as everyone had found, that certainty warms the hands in winter. The minister's wife stared out the window at a sky hard as iron and asked, very quietly, whether the devil could be exhausted. The minister said no. She said, then the town would be. The court was not yet a court. It was a table and a few chairs. It would grow fast. The afflicted named a midwife. She had brought more children into the world than anyone could count. She had poured warm water over blue lips and rubbed life back into stubborn lungs. She had also boiled herbs and stitched secret tears and held mothers who had lost. That was part of the trouble. Men fear the places where women hold their own knowledge. They call it private, and then call it suspect. The midwife lifted her chin and asked for God's mercy. She would need it. God's mercy, in Salem, was dispensed in public. The town pressed closer to itself. Doors closed earlier, curtains were drawn. The light inside homes grew more golden, more desperate. Alchemy sees in gold the signal of perfection. Salem saw in gold only the color of a flame that would not go out. When the first snowmelt cut narrow channels through the thawing roads, children followed the water with sticks, making small dams, and then laughed and pulled the dams away to watch the release. Their parents looked at the children and then at each other with a weariness that felt like age. Release would not come quickly. The dams were not made of sticks. They were made of sermons and sighs, and the habit of believing that pain, rightly applied, makes a people clean. The habit had its own momentum now, and momentum rarely yields to argument. It yields, if it yields at all, to fatigue. But fatigue was far away, for now the town was awake, and its wakefulness had the bright eyes of someone who has talked themselves into a miracle. It began with a name, then another, then a string of them, each like a bead pulled through a knot in the throat. The meeting house filled daily. Men who had once only nodded to each other in the lane now leaned shoulder to shoulder, heat rising from their coats. Women sat rigid as kindling, each glance a spark seeking tinder. Children who should have been at chores were sometimes there too, eyes wide, learning that attention can be won with a shiver and a scream. The magistrates tried for order and found a rhythm instead. A witness stood, swore, spoke. The afflicted gasped, mimed choking, stared as if a ghost had entered. The accused denied, then trembled, then appealed to heaven, then finally fell quiet as the tide proved stronger than any voice. One man described a book hidden under a hearthstone, a book with diagrams like wheels of fire. He said he had seen a woman turn its pages with her left hand. Left-handedness became a stain crossing the town. Another told of a poppet stuffed with pins. The pins were real, the poppet less so. No matter, the poppet would be found. Evidence always appears for those who know how it must look. The midwife's house was searched. Jars, again, always jars. Glass made truth visible and therefore fragile. Wormwood, valerian, rue. Latin names sounded like spells to ears trained to hear sin. The labels were peeled, and in the peeling, each plant lost its history. Anything without a past can be assigned any meaning. They assigned the worst. A servant looked at her hands and wondered why everyone stared. They were cracked from winter and work. She could not afford gloves. She had poured lye more than once and not cried out. Her endurance, once admired, now resembled immunity, and immunity resembled sorcery. Language had run ahead of sense. It would not come back for a while. Men spoke from memory about dreams. They swore they were not dreams. They used the word vision. We are careful with words when we want them to behave like facts. A minister cautioned against rash judgment. He did it from the pulpit. When the afflicted screamed during his caution, the caution became a sign, and the minister, to his astonishment, found himself named the moment he stepped down. He did not sleep that night. He watched his wife's breathing and wondered what innocence looked like, if he had ever actually seen it, and whether it made a sound he had forgotten how to hear. The blacksmith testified that iron had cooled too quickly in his trough, a sign that unnatural cold walked the town. He did not mention that the trough had been placed closer to the door that week. Facts are generous when summoned by fear. They come dressed for the part and curtsy when called. A farmer swore his cow had dried the day after he refused to sell at a neighbor's price. He did not intend to accuse the buyer, but the accusation made itself and sat between them, fat as a cat before a hearth. In such seasons, the mind does not ask whether truth is true. It asks whether truth is useful, and usefulness tends to gather where the crowd already stands. From the rafters hung ropes, not gallows ropes, not yet, but ropes for bells and banners and stores of winter meat. People looked up at them more often. They did not know why they were looking. The body looks before the mind admits what the future holds. Smoke stained the rafters. The stain thickened in a corner near the vent. A child stared at the stain until her eyes watered, then pointed and cried that she saw a face. In a way, she did. Our faces have always lived in smoke. The accused continued to deny. They were told denial was the devil's craft. Those who confessed were told confession might be God's mercy. The town did not notice that it had built a perfect machine. Deny, and you are damned. Confess, and you are proof. The only escape was to disappear, and no one disappears in a town that counts heads every Sunday. A rumor surfaced that a few of the accused owned strange books. It was true. Every town with a ship has strange books. Sailors bring them home for their wives, who learn to read a little and dream a little, and show a page to a friend, and in the showing stitch another small seam in the fabric of their own minds. That fabric, invisible, scared men who believed virtue must be thick and loud and woven in public. Invisible virtue is easy to call vice. At the edge of the crowd, a boy watched the accused more than the accusers. He noticed that the accused tried to stand beautifully, shoulders set, chin steady, eyes clear. People often try to stand beautifully when they are about to be broken. The boy would remember this. The memory would make him kinder than his neighbors when he grew old. But he said nothing now. His kindness had not yet learned to speak. A ledger was produced with marks that no one could read. The marks were numbers. They were also a code to those who needed a code. A code is only a language with its name removed. The ledger was held up like a lantern. It cast the faces of the crowd into hard planes. The hard planes made the faces look righteous. Righteousness likes that look. It feeds on it. "Name them," someone shouted. "Name them all." The afflicted did their best. A woman who had once been proud now grew quiet. Pride is loud until it sees the cost of speaking. Then it turns to iron. Iron bends or breaks, but does not chatter. She bent. She confessed that she had walked in snow without leaving prints. The town sighed in satisfaction. Ghosts leave no prints. The fact that no one had seen her walking that night did not matter. The mind accepts an image and then insists the world match it. She named a friend to spare herself. The friend's face changed in a way the town would later pretend not to remember. It is almost impossible to catch the moment a people turn from witnesses into participants. It happens between two breaths. One breath says, "I saw." The next says, "I helped." In that second breath, smoke rose, and the town smelled its own future. The room grew sharper. Voices did not blur now, they aligned. A clerk's quill moved with steady competence, skittering on paper like a small animal across snow. The record, people said, would keep them honest. Records keep us only as honest as we wish to be when we write them. Procedure arrived and settled into the chair. Procedure is the respectable cousin of fear. It wears a coat and presents schedules. It tells everyone when to stand, when to swear, when to feel. Swear, speak, point, deny, tremble, confess, name, pray, repeat. The afflicted performed without realizing it was performance. They were believed without realizing belief had become theater. If they paused, a prompter stood in the front row, the entire town, whispering the next line. Suffer, shudder, see. Spectral evidence entered with its shoes muddy from the fields. It sat wherever it liked. It had no face you could cross-examine, but it had many mouths. It spoke in dreams, in pains, in small accidents that seemed suddenly to carry intention. The court, such as it was, saw that this evidence could not be weighed and decided therefore it was light. Light enough to fly through walls and heavier than a soul. Outside, a woodpile shrank. Someone had been careless with kindling, or careful. It is difficult to tell in winter. The man stacking the last of it looked at his hands, pink and raw, and wondered when he had last touched another person without thinking of consequence. He could not remember. The town had made the body a courtroom. Every touch now testified, warm or cold, lingered or withdrew. The heart, tired of testifying, learned to sit still. Inside, the clerk asked a woman to repeat herself. She did, but slower, and the repeating changed the meaning. It always does. Repetition polishes a story into a shape that fits the hand. She said she had seen a light in the forest that moved without smoke. She said she had heard voices without mouths. Someone offered an explanation about marsh gas, but no one in Salem had ever said the words marsh gas, and so the explanation failed at the door of vocabulary. A man described a tall figure in black. The figure had been tall because the man had been afraid. Fear lengthens shadows. The court measured the shadow and found it fit many shoulders. That was useful. A woman whose husband had died the previous year told of a dream in which he stood at the foot of the bed and warned her. She began to cry. The court did not ask whether grief can be a dream's author. It recorded the warning and wrote a name after it. A shopkeeper presented a small tin vial. It contained mercury. He had bought it years ago from a sailor who said it was good for cleaning mirrors. It is good for that. The court turned the vial in the light and watched the metal shift and bead like a living thing. The living metal proved what they already felt. They wrote another name. The clerk's hand shook only once that day, when the minister's wife's name was spoken again. The clerk did not want to write the name. He wrote it. The ink blotted, a small black flower blooming where a letter should have been clear. People noticed and found in it a sign. A blot of ink is more persuasive than a page of reason when the town has decided what the blot must mean. A test was proposed, a small thing that would decide the truth. Small things are always proposed when the truth is complicated. The test was performed. Its result was ambiguous. Ambiguity has no seat in a room arranged like a cross. The result was translated into a verdict that fit the furniture. When they left the meeting house, evening had fallen without anyone noticing. Torches stood outside like second suns, their light wobbling on snow and wood and faces. Names hung in the air above each torch, the way breath hangs on a cold night. Visible for a moment, then gone, but leaving the air colder for having passed. In one home, a man knelt and prayed. He did not pray for truth. He prayed not to be named. He was honest with God in a way he could not be with his neighbors. God, who needs honesty less than mercy, listened. In another home, a woman packed a small bundle, a comb, a cloth, a coin, a folded page torn from a book. She had resolved to leave before dawn. The road in winter kills, and so does a town that has decided to save itself by fire. She weighed one death against another and did what arithmetic allows. On the square, boys kicked at a ring of ice until it broke. The circle cracked into pieces that looked briefly like runes. One boy laughed and said a word he had heard his father use: signs. The others laughed too. Children learn what counts. The bell rang once, and then again. The sound travelled. Sound always finds a way through winter. Behind it, if one listened closely, there was the faint wheel squeak of procedure rolling forward. Wood on wood. A machine in motion, built of fear and paper and the wish to be good. It would not stop because it worked. Machines rarely stop when they work. They run until fuel runs out. Salem had chosen its fuel. The trials had found their rhythm. Morning began with prayer and ended with confession. The town had become its own laboratory, each day another experiment in endurance, another test of faith's melting point. The magistrates called it procedure. The ministers called it discernment. The people called it justice. But under every name it behaved the same. It consumed. Salem had become a mirror. In it, the pious saw their reflection and mistook it for light. One clerk wrote that the devil loves confusion. He was right, though not as he meant it. Confusion is fertile soil. It grows whatever seed is planted deepest. In Salem, the seed was pride. Pride in being chosen, pride in being clean, pride in being certain. When the first snowdrops pushed through the frozen ground, the people took it as a sign that God was watching. They were half right. Something was watching. In another place and another century, an alchemist named Sendivogius had written that the true mirror of the soul is trial. He had meant that transformation comes when matter confronts its own imperfection. The idea drifted across oceans and sermons and settled here, transfigured into fear. The court's mirror was literal. The accused were made to look upon their neighbors and confess what they saw. Some described light. Some described darkness. All described themselves. The recorders did not notice the pattern. They were too busy keeping time with the gavel. Between hearings, the minister walked alone along the river. He watched the thaw carve narrow veins through ice and thought about blood. He wondered if purification required spilling. He wondered when curiosity became sin. The wind gave no answer, but it carried the scent of iron from the smithy, and the sound of hammers fell like verdicts on his heart. That night he dreamed of a mirror suspended above the town. In its surface he saw 1,000 flames reflected back, none brighter than another. When he woke, he could not tell whether he had seen damnation or salvation. The meeting house smelled of sweat and wax and something older, the musk of expectation. A crowd gathered as if for a sermon, yet what they wanted was spectacle. Piety and entertainment have always shared a pew. The gavel struck. The room answered with silence. A girl spoke first. She described a shadow bending over her bed. She described a whisper that promised gold. Gold, the color of temptation, the color of transformation. The word ran through the crowd like mercury, bright and poisonous. The accused was led in. Her eyes found the rafters where smoke had stained the wood in shapes that almost resembled wings. She said nothing. Her silence worked harder than any plea. The minister recited verses about refining in the furnace. The clerk wrote quickly, ink splattering his cuffs. Someone coughed. Someone fainted. When the fainting began, the clerk stopped writing. He watched. Watching felt like proof. The blacksmith testified about sparks that leapt from his forge without reason. He said they formed letters. The letters spelled a name. He swore it. Sparks are brief, but belief gives them memory. The accused denied. Denial sounded rehearsed, which made it suspicious. Confession sounded rehearsed, which made it divine. There was no correct music for innocence to play. At midday, the clouds thickened until the light in the windows turned the color of pewter. The judge declared the hour a sign. Lunch was forgotten. Hunger and righteousness taste the same when served hot. When the verdict came, it landed softly, like ash. The condemned crossed herself and whispered a word no one understood. Perhaps mercy, perhaps transmutation. Either would have meant the same. The guard touched her shoulder. His hand shook once, then steadied. He would dream of that touch for the rest of his life. The people filed out beneath the dull sky, their breath forming halos that vanished as quickly as they formed. They told themselves the air felt cleaner. It did not. It only felt empty. The gallows stood on a hill just beyond the last row of houses. Snow drifted around its legs like a dog waiting for command. The rope swung without wind. A crowd gathered again, quieter now, reverent in the way people become when they sense history arranging itself before them. The condemned walked with a calm that unsettled the watchers. Someone said she smiled. Someone else said the smile was the devil's mask. No one asked why a mask would need to smile at all. When it was over, the people prayed. Prayer is the most efficient alchemy. It turns fear into form, guilt into sound, silence into approval. Ash settled on their coats. It would cling there through the night, into their dreams, into the next hearing. They would wash and find small grey streaks on their wrists and think of them as blessings. The minister returned to his study. He opened his Bible and could not read the words. The letters swam like molten lead. He closed the book and sat in darkness until the candle died. When dawn came, the first light glinted on the extinguished wick like a tear frozen in glass. Outside, the snow had stopped. Smoke from the hill drifted east toward the sea. The tide received it without question. The world, after all, is patient with our mistakes. It has seen them before. By midsummer, the air itself seemed tired of judgment. The sky dimmed to brass and the river ran low. The gallows creaked even when no wind moved. 20 souls had been claimed by then, some with prayers on their lips, some with silence, some with laughter that made the crowd uneasy. The laughter lived longest. People remembered it at night and turned the memory into proof. The sermons did not stop. They grew longer. The words purity, trial, and fire threaded through every homily until they became one sound, the heartbeat of a town convinced that it could burn its way to peace. Ash drifted down on roofs and fields. It mixed with the soil. Wheat grew through it. Children played in it. The line between judgment and harvest blurred. At dusk, the minister walked the empty street and saw small fires flickering in hearths behind closed shutters. The fires looked alike, orange, hungry, obedient. He thought of alchemical drawings, ovens labelled Athanor, vessels sealed until the transformation was complete. Salem, he realized, had sealed itself. The condemned were gone, yet the town continued to refine itself. People confessed lesser sins now, sleeping too late, doubting too quietly, speaking out of turn. Confession had become currency, a way to prove existence. He wondered how many more refinements a soul could survive before only smoke remained. That night, in his study, he wrote a single line. The experiment consumes its maker. He did not sign it. Some truths are safer anonymous. Fear, like metal, fatigues. The town had begun to crack. Neighbours who once shouted accusations now crossed the road to avoid eye contact. The afflicted no longer screamed. They whispered, uncertain whether their own visions were holy or hunger. Even the magistrates spoke softer, as if afraid of echo. The meeting house benches were half empty. The sound that filled the gaps was wind. A widow sold her farm and fled north. A child stopped eating. The tavern closed its shutters at dusk. The air smelled of rain that would not fall. Inside the smithy, the forge went cold. Iron sat black and waiting, a mirror of the people who had wielded it. The smith pressed his hand to the ashes and left the print of his palm, a dark star upon grey dust. He thought of the first sermon that started all this. To be chosen is to be tried. He had believed it. Now he understood that the trial never ends. It only forgets why it began. The minister's wife kept a diary. On the final page she wrote, "The fire asks for everything and gives only light to see what we have lost." In the fields beyond town, new wheat bent under the weight of summer rain. The ash washed deeper into the soil. The children who survived would grow in that soil. They would learn a different lesson, that purity promised by fire leaves the heart hollow. The minister watched the storm roll in. For the first time, thunder did not sound like judgment. It sounded like release. He closed his eyes and let the wind extinguish the last candle. The darkness that followed was not evil. It was rest. Autumn arrived early. Leaves browned before they turned gold. The fields gave a thin yield, yet no one complained. Gratitude had replaced plenty as the town's single virtue. Those who had testified the loudest now spoke softly, or not at all. The afflicted girls avoided each other's eyes. They had been instruments. The song was finished. The gallows rotted in the rain. Children dared each other to touch it and run. No one repaired it. The wood was too heavy with memory. The minister preached one last sermon on the hill. His voice cracked. He told them that grace is not a furnace, that God requires no smoke. The crowd listened because they were tired, and tiredness resembles wisdom from a distance. When he finished, no one shouted Amen. They simply turned toward their homes, each carrying a private ember of thought, that maybe salvation is quieter than fire. In later years, letters surfaced, scraps of parchment found behind hearthstones, folded pages in the bindings of hymnals. They spoke in careful code about transmutation, about the spiritus mundi, the breath of the world that turns matter toward light. Historians called them curiosities. The faithful called them heresies. Yet the handwriting was familiar. The same hands that had built the town's houses, baked its bread, buried its dead. The same hands that had trembled in prayer. Perhaps the people of Salem had not abandoned the dream of transformation after all. They had only hidden it, buried it beneath ashes, where seeds wait for spring. Years later, travelers passing the old meeting house would find flakes of mica glinting in the dust between the floorboards. They thought it gold. They pocketed it as luck. It was not gold. It was only the earth remembering light. But memory is its own alchemy. It turns pain into story, and story into warning, and warning into wisdom, if anyone listens long enough. Centuries later, in libraries far from Salem, scholars uncovered fragments of those same ideas, treatises on the philosopher's stone, marginal notes on divine light hidden in matter. They noticed a phrase repeated in several. Through trial, the soul remembers its origin. It echoed across time like a bell under water. Salem had rung it once without knowing. They had believed trial would prove their purity. The alchemists had believed trial would prove their humanity. Between those beliefs stretched the whole distance between fire that cleanses and fire that consumes. The manuscripts described the world as a living body. To harm any part of it was to darken the whole. The people of Salem had learned that too late. But they had learned it. The story ends where it began, with fire. Fire that warms, fire that warns, fire that remembers. A light in the hearth, a glow in the crucible, a spark in the mind. It asks nothing but attention and offers nothing but change. The people of Salem are dust now, their names worn thin on stone. Yet in every flame that bends and breathes, there is the same question that haunted them. What will you make of the heat you are given? Because every life is a small experiment in transformation. Every fear a substance waiting to be turned. And every age, when frightened, builds its own furnace and calls it faith. If we listen carefully, the wind still carries their lesson, that the divine does not demand fire. It simply waits for light.